Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Natalia Suri and welcome to my show. So what are we going to do today? Today I'm going to talk to Anuradha Kumar, the famous and the versatile writer who really does not need an introduction. Her works like Letter for Paul, Dollmaker's Island, It Takes a Murder are books which are bestsellers, so which I really don't need to say or do anything more about. But we'll be talking to her about her book, Coming Back to the City. So come, let us chat with her. I have the honor of talking to Anuradha Kumar, the lady behind many novels. So we'll be talking to her regarding the first novel, one of her novels, Coming Back to the City. Anuradha, or I should call you Anu. I think Anu is fine, yeah. So what inspired you to write on this subject, which is based on the chawls of Mumbai?
Okay, I lived in Bombay for several years, 14 years. And we used to live in that part of Bombay in central Mumbai, which has seen a lot of redevelopment. The chawls being given over to real estate housing projects, big skyscrapers and high rises. And I noticed that development, and I happened to be working for a magazine called the Economic and Political Weekly, which is an academic social science journal. And it's an old magazine. It's still around and doing quite well. It's more than 60 years old, and I used to go through its pages and all the articles there that talked about the history of Bombay, the 70s, how the labor unions protested against what was happening in the textile mills, and early 80s, the great textile strike. So I kind of knew the background, and it fascinated me about how a city was changing, how lives were being upended, and it sort of fascinated me, and I wanted to tell a story more from a fictional and a literary point of view rather than the mere historical. So essentially that was that, yeah. And I loved Bombay because I lived there for many years, yes.
You've written about for children, you have written historical, now you've written this for the common man staying in the chawl. So how different is each one of them, and particularly writing this genre from the others?
When my first novel, Letters for Paul, was set in a small town in Orissa. I grew up in Orissa. I was born there actually a long time ago. So I liked the concept of writing a book which helps in building a whole new world, teeming with characters, teeming with possibilities, and where the characters become living people in their own right, telling their own stories. So essentially it began from there. But and I wanted to make this novel something that reflected Bombay itself, a big city, a metropolis with many kinds of people making their lives, making a living there. And it's something I had set my heart on, and I'm glad I got a chance to write this book, and I'm glad Speakingtiger published it. So yeah, it's a long story, but finally I'm glad I got a chance to do it.
You have dealt with many characters in this particular novel. So was it very challenging, and how did you plan with dealing with so many characters in this novel? 4 years ago, I was doing my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts at Vermont here, and it began with sending a short story to my teacher. One of the short stories in this book, it's become a chapter, but you can see it as a short story itself. And I got the idea. There were similar books written before, but I'll tell you in a bit. That from that one story, there were other characters in that story, and I knew I could build up a novel linking those characters together and their lives, in a way reflecting the city itself, because in a city people live in close proximity to each other, and their lives are linked to each other. And I wanted to have a novel like that, with interconnected stories, with people whose lives are connected to each other. Having said that, earlier this decade there was this novel or a book of short stories by the writer Elizabeth Strout called Olive Kittredge, and it's very fascinating. They made us a serial out of it also, about a woman who's all the stories have the woman character in it, but they deal with different aspects. So it's a book of interconnected stories. So I got fascinated by that concept, and I read similar stories like James Joyce's Dubliners, which is set in Dublin, many characters. So I guess I wanted to try out my own experiment, sort of. When you did this book, you lived with each character in your mind, or you plotted out the whole thing? How did you go about writing this book, playing with so many characters?
Yeah, Yeah, I lived with them, and I didn't conscientiously seek out to plot it all down in a diagram. Though I think I should have. But it worked out because I spent a lot of time with them. Spent almost 2.5 years writing this book. Uh, so yes, once a character got into me. Once I thought that this character, like for instance, the second story, Neera Joshi, the older lady who's worked with the labor unions. I lived with that character, and once you think about what a person might do, what her reactions might be, then that person starts telling her own story. So it became something like that, living in, letting the character seep into you and then writing it out over time. I'm not sure I'm explaining it well, but yeah, essentially that was it.
I have one last question. You have stayed in Singapore, you have stayed in US. So why out of all those places you chose a chawl in Bombay and not Singapore and not US, some based there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll have to go back again to something else. I've realized that it's been about 18 years or so since I started writing, since I became a published writer. But I realized to write about a place, it takes time. It takes really years, even a decade or so, to let that place seep into you before you really feel comfortable talking about a place. And having said that, especially in that town in Orissa where I grew up, where Letters for Paul is based, it was just, I was very young then, and there was a lot of so-called eve teasing going on, and I used to be very scared going out into the streets. So I didn't even want to think about that city and that town where I grew up. But only after I had left it, a sufficient distance of 20 years had passed, then I realized that it just happened very organically that I could talk about that. That I could think about that city because it had been a formative part of my life, and then begin to write about it. I'm not saying that I did this very conscientiously or there was an actual thought process going behind it. It just happened organically. I think it's same thing happened like that about Bombay. I left the city about 12 years ago, and it's a city very dear to me, and I wanted to somehow write about it. But only it must have taken this much of time for me to become comfortable doing so, or natural doing so. So I guess I didn't live long in Singapore, about 3 years. So let's see. I've written short stories, but I don't think they're in a publishable form yet. But let's see. So.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing your views on the book, and thank you so much for joining, ma'am. And I'm sure my viewers, are going to love this book. I'm sure about it.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to see you in person, and I saw your videos.
So I was in conversation with Anuradha Kumar, the famous and the versatile writer who has written historic fiction for children. She's a complete writer, and I have learned a lot of things from her. So if you have any questions for her, perhaps you could email me on my email address given below. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Tata, bye-bye. And do tune in my next show, which would be soon. But before that, you need to subscribe, and don't forget to subscribe. That's very important. Tata, bye bye, take care.